Somewhere beneath the Sahara Desert, under all that sand and silence and shimmering heat, there is a memory. Not a metaphor, not a figure of speech, but a real, physical memory written in ancient lake beds and fossilized bones, and bones of cattle, and the roots of trees long turned to stone. A memory of a time when this place, the largest hot desert on Earth, was something else entirely. Something almost unimaginable if you've ever seen photographs of the Sahara as it is today. Here is what the science tells us. Roughly 10,000 years ago, the Sahara was green. Not patches of green, not occasional oases, but genuinely, broadly, abundantly green. There were lakes deep enough to sustain fish. There were rivers threading through grasslands. There were elephants and hippos and crocodiles living in places that are now among the most arid landscapes on the planet. People lived there too, real communities, building things, watching the sky, raising cattle, developing beliefs about the world that were sophisticated enough to leave behind structures we still don't fully understand. And somewhere in what is now the Egyptian Sahara, in a place called Nabta Playa, those people built something. Stones arranged with a precision that seems to reach toward the sun and stars. A site older than Stonehenge, sitting in a desert that has swallowed almost every other trace of the world that produced it. That is what this journey is about tonight. The lost green world of the Sahara, the people who built their lives inside it, and the quiet, persistent mystery of what they left behind when the rains finally stopped and the desert returned to reclaim everything. We'll move slowly through it. Climate and time, belief and sky, adaptation and loss. It's the kind of story that asks you to let your mind settle and drift. Before we begin, I want to ask you something. Where are you right now, and what time is it? Are you in bed with the lights off, somewhere in the middle of the night? Somewhere early and grey? I always read the comments, and it genuinely fascinates me. Someone drifting off in Auckland, someone sleepless in Chicago, all of us, together, listening to the same old earth remember itself. To understand how the Sahara turned green, you have to go back even further than the people who lived there, back to something subtle and slow and almost impossibly large in scale, the tilt of the earth, every few tens of thousands of years. The way our planet tilts on its axis shifts slightly, the way it wobbles. The shape of its orbit around the sun changes in small but consequential ways. These are called Milankovitch cycles, named after the Serbian astronomer who worked them out in the early 20th century, and they are one of the fundamental rhythms of the planet. Small adjustments in angle and distance that, over thousands of years, redistribute where sunlight falls and how intensely. And roughly 11,000 years ago, one of those shifts lined up in a way that changed Africa forever. The Northern Hemisphere was receiving more solar energy during summer than it does today. More heat over the landmass of North Africa specifically. That extra warmth intensified what climatologists call the African monsoon. The seasonal rains that normally stop well south of the Sahara began pushing northward, carried by atmospheric pressure systems responding to the heat of the land. Year after year, decade after decade, the rains came further north than they had in thousands of years. This period has a name. Scientists call it the African humid period, and it lasted in various forms from roughly 11,000 years ago to about 5,000 years ago, 6,000 years of rain, falling on a place we now think of as the definition of barren. What that rain built is extraordinary to try to picture. The Sahara during this period had rivers. Not just seasonal trickles, but real rivers, some of them substantial enough to leave behind clear channels and terraces that satellite imaging has revealed in the last few decades, buried now under sand, but still legible to the right instruments. There were lakes scattered across the landscape, some of them large enough that you could not see across them. One ancient lake, in what is now Chad, called Mega Lake Chad, covered an area roughly the size of the Caspian Sea. There were wetlands and reed beds and shallow seasonal ponds that filled each year with the monsoon and slowly drew down through the dry months, sustaining life around their edges the way the Nile sustains life today. Between the water systems there was grass. savanna-type grasslands stretching across latitudes where nothing grows now except sand and rock. And where there is grass, everything else follows. Hippos moved through the rivers and wallowed in the shallow lakes of what is now Algeria, Libya, and Niger. This is not speculation. Their bones have been found there, excavated from ancient sediments in places that receive perhaps 1 inch of rain per year today. Crocodiles slid through those same waters. The fish were abundant enough that communities could build sustained settlements around fishing, which we know because archaeologists have found fish bones and fish hooks and net weights at sites deep in what is now absolute desert. Elephants moved through the grasslands in herds. Buffalo and antelope grazed where camels now struggle to find anything worth eating. Some of the most vivid evidence for all of this does not come from sediment cores or fossil records. It comes from art. In the mountains of the central Sahara, in places like the Nabta Plateau in Algeria and the Fezzan region of Libya, there are thousands of rock paintings and engravings. Some of the oldest of them, made during the Green Period, show a world that looks almost nothing like the landscape surrounding them today. There are cattle with graceful, wide-sweeping horns. There are giraffes, painted with careful attention to their proportions. There are hippos. There are scenes of people fishing from boats, people herding animals, people dancing and gathering and apparently celebrating. There are figures that seem to be swimming, rendered with a loose, fluid energy that suggests the artists knew water well and thought of it as a normal, abundant part of life. These paintings are not imagination. They are memory and documentation and something that functions almost like affection. People painted what mattered to them, what surrounded them, what fed them and filled their world. And what filled their world during the African humid period was a landscape of startling richness. What's worth sitting with for a moment is the sheer duration of this. 6,000 years is not a brief interlude. It is roughly the same amount of time that separates us from the earliest Egyptian pharaohs. It is long enough for dozens of human generations to be born, live out their entire lives, and die without ever knowing the Sahara as anything other than green. Long enough for cultures to develop, for knowledge to accumulate, for ways of understanding the world to become deeply rooted. Long enough for people to stop thinking of themselves as visitors to a temporary landscape and begin to think of it as home. That matters because it means the people who eventually moved into this green Sahara were not just passing through. They were settling. They were adapting. They were developing relationships with specific places, specific water sources, specific seasonal patterns, in the same way that every human community throughout history has developed relationships with the land beneath it. The green Sahara was a world, not a geological curiosity or a brief climatic footnote, but an actual world where actual people built actual lives. And some of what they built has survived, against extraordinary odds in forms we are still trying to read. If you could walk into that world now, the first thing you might notice is how little anyone seems in a hurry. Morning on the edge of a shallow lake, mist rising off the water in thin veils. The air is cool in a way that would shock anyone who only knows the Sahara as a furnace. You're part of a small band camped on a low ridge above the shore. Behind you, the land rises into rocky hills. In front of you, the water stretches out, a dull, pale mirror. You can hear fish breaking the surface, birds calling in the reeds, cattle shifting and snorting quietly in the half-light. People are already up, not because of an alarm or a schedule, but because the day itself has a rhythm that everyone knows. The old woman who always wakes before dawn is already checking the hearths, feeling the half-buried pots where embers stayed warm all night. 2 of the younger men are down at the water's edge, wading in with their nets rolled over one shoulder. Children are still wrapped in skins or woven mats, but a few curious ones lift their heads, watching who goes where, learning the pattern without anyone ever formally teaching it. This is not a village with walls and streets and permanent houses. It is a camp, a cluster of shelters made from poles and brush and animal hides. Some of the people here have been born on this lake shore. Some remember arriving just a few years ago. A few know another lake, several days' walk to the south, where their grandparents used to camp when they were the age of the children now peering from under blankets. Mobility is part of the design. You live lightly on the land because the land itself is always changing. The lake you're camped beside now is not constant. Each year, the monsoon swells it. Each dry season, it shrinks, leaving new shorelines, new mudflats, new stands of reeds. Some years, the rains fail a little, and the water pulls back more than usual. Some years, floods cut new channels into the surrounding plain. Over decades, entire shorelines migrate. A camp that was right at the water's edge when your mother was a child might now be hundreds of meters from the nearest drinkable water. People respond the way humans always have. They move. Not randomly, not in panic, but in a pattern that has been learned and refined. When the rains come and small seasonal ponds fill across the plain, groups fan out, exploring fresh grazing for their animals, fresh patches of edible plants. When the dry season deepens, they contract again toward the most reliable lakes and rivers. Sometimes two bands who haven't seen each other for a year end up on the same shore, their camps separated by a respectful stretch of ground. There's visiting, cautious at first, then warmer. News is exchanged, stories about births and deaths and strange weather. Maybe a marriage is arranged. Maybe a stone tool made from a kind of rock no one in your band has seen before is admired, turned over in experienced hands and eventually traded. From the distance of thousands of years, archaeologists will look at the traces left by these movements and try to reconstruct this world. They will find clusters of hearths and broken pots, layers of fish bones and animal remains, scatters of stone flakes from tool making. They'll notice that some sites were used briefly for a season or two. Others are built up in layers, reused again and again over centuries as favourite stopping points on a regular circuit. They'll see that around the oldest lake margins, the remains are mostly from wild animals and fish. In later layers, cattle bones appear more often, and in ways that don't match the pattern of wild cattle killed at random. The animals are of different ages, culled in a way that suggests planning rather than luck. This is early herding. If you step back into the morning at the lake, you can watch that transition in motion. Down by the shore, fishing is already well underway. The two men move through the water with the kind of economy that comes from thousands of hours of practice. Their nets are simple but effective. Long panels of plant fibre, weighted at the bottom with smooth stones. Floats along the top made from bits of wood or reed. They set them in a gentle curve, then slowly drive fish into the waiting mesh with splashes and quiet shouts. Further along, a woman stands knee-deep, a carved bone hook in her hand, a line coiled beside her. She's in a spot where the drop-off is abrupt. She knows from seasons of experience that the bigger fish patrol this line. Behind her, on the damp shore, fish already caught lie in a neat row, sorted by size, ready to be cleaned, smoked, dried, or eaten immediately. Fishing is a major part of life here, but it's not the only strategy, nor is it the only strategy you have to rely on. Back at camp, a group is preparing to leave for the day. 2 adolescents with digging sticks, 3 older women, a few smaller children. They're heading away from the water toward a well-known patch of land where certain tubers grow thickly after the rains. They'll walk by memory, guided by landmarks that have names and stories. On the way out, they'll check stands of wild grain, see whether the seeds are ripe enough to harvest. They'll note where game trails cross the low ridges, which shrubs are flowering, where bees seem to be working. All of this will be stored not in notebooks, but in talk, in the steady flow of language that keeps younger minds aligned with the patterns their elders know by heart. On the hillside above the camp, a small herd grazes. These are cattle, but not like modern breeds. They are rangy, long-legged, with horns that sweep in broad arcs. They are also not entirely wild and not entirely tame. Some have been handled since birth, used to human presence following the calls of the herders. Others were born to cows that once roamed free and still have their own ideas about where to walk and when. The people who tend them are experimenting, though they would not put it that way. They know that following wild herds of animals can be unpredictable. Migratory routes change. A bad year can scatter game. Fish stocks in the lake can fluctuate. Growing attached to a small, managed herd of cattle is one way to anchor yourself against that uncertainty. In the archaeological record, this shift leaves faint but recognizable fingerprints. The bones of cattle become more common relative to other wild species. Cut marks on those bones show patterns of butchery that suggest regular slaughtering of young males and preservation of breeding females, a classic pastoral strategy. Pottery appears with residues of milk fats clinging to the inner surfaces, microscopic traces that modern chemistry can tease out. People are not just killing cattle, they are milking them, incorporating them into daily life in a way that implies repeated, close contact. The pottery itself is its own story. Early on, people here made simple containers, clay shaped by hand, tempered with bits of sand or crushed shell, fired in open hearths. Functional, unadorned, meant to hold water or store dried fish or seeds. Over time, patterns appear. Fingertip impressions pressed around the rim, incised lines made with a stick or a bit of bone. Later still, more complex geometric designs. These are not random doodles. They are habits, inherited motifs, perhaps markers of identity. One cluster of lakeshores prefers a certain style of decoration. Another, days away on foot, favours a different pattern. When pots with mixed styles appear in a single camp, it hints at visiting, intermarriage, exchange. Burials tell another side of the story. Not far from some of these long-used campsites, archaeologists find graves. Some are simple, a body laid in a shallow pit, curled on its side, covered with sand. Others are more elaborate, a person buried with beads made from ostrich eggshell, each tiny disc painstakingly shaped and drilled. A cow laid to rest beside a human, or even over them, arranged with care. In some cases, stones have been placed to outline the grave. In others, the dead are sprinkled with red ochre, a pigment carried from distant deposits. All of this suggests something beyond mere survival. It suggests attachment to particular animals, particular people, particular places, to ideas about what happens after death and what is owed to those who have gone. Over centuries, the pattern that emerges across the Green Sahara is not one of isolated bands wandering randomly through an empty expanse. It is a network of mobile communities, each with its own circuit of favoured water sources and pastures, but all indirectly connected. People on the northern margins interact now and then with groups closer to the Mediterranean coast. A stone tool made from flint that comes from far away. A shell from a sea none of the local children have ever seen. To the south, others move in and out of contact with populations inhabiting what are now the Sahel and the savannas beyond. Styles of pottery echo and diverge. Ways of handling cattle spread, then adapt to local conditions. Ideas and genes and stories flow along these human routes, slowly, unevenly, but steadily. To stand in the Sahara today and look out across the sand is to imagine a border, a barrier between North Africa and the rest of the continent. During the African humid period, that mental map would make no sense at all. The Sahara was not a wall. It was a lived-in, walked through, fished in, grazed across cultural zone. A place of movement, yes, but also of return. People knew certain rocks, certain bays of certain lakes, certain groves of trees where the shade fell a particular way in late afternoon. They named them. They remembered them. They buried their dead nearby. In that landscape of water and grass, with its shifting lakes and travelling bands, something else was slowly taking shape. Certain places, used again and again, began to matter more than others. A rise of ground overlooking a seasonal playa, a cluster of bedrock outcrops that caught the eye, a spot where the sky felt particularly wide and the horizon particularly clean. On one such patch of ground, in what is now southern Egypt, people would eventually begin to set stones upright in careful patterns, marking something they had noticed, or honouring something they had come to believe, or both. We call that place Nabta Playa, and it sits now in the middle of what looks like endless, empty desert. If you could visit it in the moment it mattered most, Nabta Playa would not look like a mystery. It would look like a place people knew. Not the way you know a modern city with street names and addresses, but the way your ancestors knew a favourite campsite. A place you come back to when the water is right and the grass is good. A familiar rise of ground above a broad, shallow basin that, in the rainy season, turns into a glittering sheet of water. The playa itself is huge, a flat depression stretching for miles, ringed by low stony ridges. During the peak of the monsoon, rain falling hundreds of kilometres to the south feeds streams that thread across the desert and spill into this shallow bowl. For a few months, it is a lake, not deep, but wide, dotted with reeds and shallows, humming with insects, birds and life. Then the dry season returns and the water shrinks. Patches of damp mud crack and harden. Salt crystals bloom along the margins. What was open water becomes pasture, then bare ground. The shoreline retreats, leaving a faint ring of altered soil, a necklace around the basin. You and your people understand this rhythm intimately. You plan your movements around it. In some years, you arrive when the basin is still full, camping on the ridge where the ground is firm and the breeze is steady. You water your cattle at the edge of the playa, then lead them out to graze on the fresh growth around its margins. Fish in the deeper pools, collect wild plants in the wetter pockets, watch the flocks of birds arrive in wheeling clouds. In other years, especially later, when the rains have begun to falter, you return knowing the lake will be smaller. You know exactly where the last water will linger. You know which gullies will hold a trickle of flow after storms, which low points are the first to green up when the monsoon arrives. That knowledge is not just in your head. It is written, in a way, into the stones. Step up onto the low ridge at Nabta Playa, and you find that the surface is not empty. Scattered among the natural rock are stones that do not quite match their surroundings. Blocks and slabs that have been moved, stood up, and arranged. Some are humble, waist-high uprights, barely more noticeable than a fence post. Others are larger, heavy megaliths that would take several people, ropes and levers of wood to shift. They stand in loose rows and clusters, some solitary, some in alignments that seem to point somewhere beyond themselves. A little farther from the playa's edge, on a gently sloping patch of ground, you come to a ring. It is not grand, not in the way later stone circles in Europe will be. The tallest stones might only reach your hip. Many are just stubs half buried, their tops rounded by sand and time. But they are not random. They form a roughly circular pattern, a deliberate enclosure of space. If you walk around it slowly, you notice that a few stones are different. 4 of them, in particular, stand out, set in pairs. In the deep past, when this ring was new, each would have framed a view along a very specific line of sight, toward the point on the horizon where the sun rises on the longest day of the year, toward where it sets when the days are shortest. Later, much later, archaeologists will measure these orientations with instruments and calculations. They will talk about solstices, celestial alignments, archaeastronomy. For you, standing there as part of the community that built it, the words are different, but the experience is the same. You know that the sun does not rise in exactly the same place every morning. You have watched its path shift, a little each day, along the rim of the world. You have noticed that certain stars appear only in certain seasons, that the bright band of the Milky Way arches across the sky differently as the months pass. You have linked those changes to the life of the playa below. The arrival of the rains, the filling and emptying of the basin, the growth and withering of grass. Someone in your band, maybe many someones over generations, have paid attention to these patterns with a patience that borders on devotion. They have remembered. They have told stories. They have pointed out to children lying awake on clear nights where a particular star rises, and what that has meant in years past. At some point, the decision was made. We will mark this. Not just in words or in memory, but in stone. The process is slow. There is no rush. Stones are chosen from nearby outcrops, pried loose, shaped a little perhaps, though not as finely carved as later monuments. They are hauled to the chosen spot in the cool hours of morning or late afternoon, slid along logs, levered with poles, rocked into position. Holes are dug, bases wedged in with smaller stones. Children watch. Elders comment on the placement. Someone remembers how, years ago, during a particularly big flood, the water reached almost to this line. Someone else points out that when you stand between these two stones at a certain time of year, the sun seems to rise directly in the gap. By the time the arrangement feels right, the place has taken on a different weight in people's minds. It is no longer just a convenient campsite by a reliable water source. It is a reference point, a kind of calendar etched onto the landscape, where the motion of the sky can be seen and fixed in relation to the ground. Around the circle and the alignments, life goes on. Hearths are lit, pots are made, used and broken. Bones accumulate in refuse pits. Cattle, sheep or goats, perhaps a few wild antelope. Shards of pottery, some decorated with familiar patterns, others with designs that hint at visitors from other lakes and other circuits, scatter the surface. The dead are buried nearby, sometimes with beads, sometimes with the bones of carefully placed animals. Archaeologists will find this long afterward. They will map the stone circle and measure the orientations of its lines. They will catalogue the megaliths, some aligned roughly north-south, others in more ambiguous patterns. They will sift through the surrounding sand for charcoal, pottery and bones, piecing together dates and sequences. They will see that the people who used Nabta Playa were pastoralists, that they moved with their herds, returning again and again to this basin over centuries, that they were not farmers in the river valley sense, nor urban builders. They did not leave palaces or pyramids. They left something quieter, a landscape that has been nudged into meaning. And this is where the puzzle deepens, because the stones are too intentional to be dismissed as chance, but not elaborate enough to explain themselves. Some lines really do seem to point towards solstitial sunrise or sunset. Others may line up, roughly, with certain bright stars as they would have appeared at that time. The ring could mark the turn of the year, helping herders anticipate when the monsoon might arrive, when to move, when to expect the playa to fill. Or it could be more than that. Perhaps the stone circle is a place where stories about the sky are anchored, where myths about powerful animals or ancestral beings are told in relation to specific points on the horizon. Perhaps certain stones commemorate particular events, unusual floods, harsh droughts, the death of an important person. Perhaps the megaliths, some standing alone at a distance, mark pathways across the plain, invisible threads connecting this basin to other significant spots. The builders did not leave inscriptions. There are no carved explanations, no surviving chants or prayers. What remains are patterns of stone, of distance, of direction. Looking at them from the vantage point of the present, you can feel the intention without fully grasping the message. It is like overhearing a language you almost recognize, catching rhythms and repeated sounds, but not quite enough to translate. That lingering gap is the heart of Nabta Playa's mystery. This was a place where people who depended on cattle and rain and their own mobility chose to do something extra, to take time and energy away from immediate needs and invest it in shaping a durable marker, something that would persist even when the lake shrank, when camps shifted, when individuals died. They oriented stone to water, stone to sky, stone to memory. Exactly what they wanted this monument to do, for the living, for the dead, for the seasons, for the spirits they believed in. We can outline only impossibilities. We can see that it mattered. We can see that it was used, revisited, modified. We can see that for them, a shallow desert lake and the arc of the heavens above it belonged to the same conversation. To get closer to that conversation, you have to follow the clues outward. From the stones themselves to the cattle bones and milk residues to the wider world of grass and storm and shifting shorelines that framed their choices. Because Nabta Playa was not just a stone circle in the sand. It was one point in a whole network of water, animals and sky that defined life in the green Sahara. If you sat down beside the stone circle on a clear night, long before the desert reclaimed the lake, the first thing you would notice is that the sky is busy. There are no city lights, no smog, no distant highway glow. Just the Milky Way, bright enough to cast the faintest shadow. A slow wheeling of stars that repeat their patterns year after year, but never in exactly the same place at exactly the same time. You grow up under this sky. You sleep beneath it most nights of the year. You notice things without trying. A particular bright star appears again just before dawn, low on the eastern horizon after many weeks of absence. Soon after, clouds begin to build, tentative at first, then more confidently. A familiar southern wind picks up, carrying the promise of distant thunder. Within days or weeks, the first real rains arrive, and the dry basins stir. After a few years of paying attention, you can't help but link the star and the wind and the water. After a few generations, that link is no longer just a coincidence. It's knowledge. By the time people are dragging stones up onto the ridge at Nabta Playa, this kind of knowledge is already deep in the bones of the community. Not as charts and tables, not as equations, but as stories and expectations. The old men and women can tell you, when that star returns to the morning, the grass will soon return to the plain. When the sun rises from that notch in the hills, the worst of the heat is coming. When it climbs from that other point, low and far along the horizon, the longest nights are ending. Archaeologists, working many thousands of years later, try to reconstruct these mental calendars with measuring tapes and software. They stand where you might have stood and record the bearings of each stone. They compare those lines to where the sun rises and sets at different times of year, to where certain bright stars would have first appeared in the dawn sky around 6000 BC. Some matches are striking. A pair of stones lines up closely with the sunrise at the summer solstice. Another pair points toward the winter solstice sunset. Within the circle, other stones might approximate the rising points of stars that, back then, were important markers of the rainy season. Is this deliberate, or is it pattern-seeking, the human tendency to see significance in coincidence? That question hangs over every interpretation of Nabta Playa. One possibility is that the builders were doing something quite practical. If you can fix a sightline in stone, you don't have to rely only on memory. Stand between these two stones. Watch where the sun rises. When it lifts exactly in the gap, you know you are near the turning point of the year, either the time when days will begin to shorten or the time when nights will stop lengthening. If your life depends on anticipating the arrival of rain and the filling of seasonal lakes, those turning points matter. They tell you when to start moving toward the big basins, when to leave higher, drier ground, when to expect that old familiar hollow in the desert to transform into water and pasture. But precision is a slippery idea here. The stones at Nabta Playa are not carved with the fineness of later observatories. Their alignments are approximate, sometimes a few degrees off the exact solstitial points. Some archaeologists argue that the builders could not have intended sophisticated star alignments, that the matches are too loose, the methods too uncertain. Others answer that you don't need razor accuracy to keep time in a seasonal world. If you are herding cattle, what matters is not the exact moment of the solstice to the day or the hour. What matters is a reliable sense that the year is turning, that the big shift in heat and rain is near. A rough corridor of sunrise, marked between two standing stones, might be more than enough to cue stories and decisions. Think about how your aunt in the earlier scene knew where tubers grew, where mushrooms might appear. She didn't need a GPS coordinate. She needed a cluster of signs, a pattern of cues. The people at Nabta Playa may have used the sky the same way. Still, even if the alignments helped track seasons, it is hard to imagine that this circle was just a calendar. Around the stones, archaeologists have found something else. The remains of cattle placed carefully in pits, sometimes ranged as if the animal were still resting, sometimes with skull and horns emphasized. These are not random bones thrown into trash heaps. They look like offerings. In some cases, the cattle were interred in stone-lined chambers, as though they too were being honoured or escorted or transformed. This hints at a different layer of meaning. In a pastoral society, cattle are not just walking food. They are wealth, security, milk in lean times, power in negotiations. They are also, in many African traditions, part of the bridge between living people and ancestors, between earth and sky. If you grow up in this world, you hear stories about the first cattle, about who brought them, where they came from, what promises were made around them. You might learn that the well-being of the herd is tied to the favour of unseen beings, to the right performance of rituals, to the remembering of names. Now imagine gathering at Nabta Playa when the basin has just filled. Groups arrive from different directions, their herds lowing, their children excited to see cousins they only meet during this season. Fires are lit on the ridge. Milk is shared, songs traded, news exchanged. At some point, people move toward the stones. Maybe an elder traces a path from a megalith standing by itself to the circle, telling the story of how their ancestors first followed the storms along this route. Maybe a young man leads a favourite cow toward a prepared pit, its horns decorated, its coat rubbed down and polished. Words are spoken, a cut is made, blood seeps into the sand. The act is both concrete and symbolic. You're giving up something valuable now in the hope of stability, favour, continuation later. You are weaving the life of your herd into the rhythms of the sky and the water. The stone circle becomes, in this sense, a kind of hinge, a place where practical concerns, when will the rains come, how do we move, who has rights to this water, are braided together with ideas about sacredness and obligation. Some researchers see Nabta Playa almost as a sanctuary, a central meeting place where dispersed herding groups reaffirmed their connections, arranged marriages, resolved disputes, and renewed their relationship with whatever forces they believed ruled over cattle and rain. In that view, the stones mark not only time, but territory and belonging. They tell you, this is a place that matters in more than one way. Here, the sky speaks. Here, the ancestors are close. Here, the community comes together when the lake blooms. Other scholars are more cautious. They warn against importing too much from later African cattle cults or from famous monuments like Stonehenge. They remind us that a few alignments can be accidental, that rituals can be small and local without sweeping cosmic symbolism. Maybe, they suggest, the circle began as a modest way to remember a specific event, a particularly generous flood, a remarkable drought, the burial of a revered herder whose cattle once saved people in a hard year. Over time, as people kept returning, they added stones, they modified alignments, they placed more cattle bones. What started as a marker of one story became the stage for many. These perspectives don't cancel each other out. They sit side by side, like the stones themselves, a device for seasonal timekeeping, a focus for cattle rituals, a social magnet where scattered bands reunited, a sacred space where earth and sky were held in a deliberate relationship. Nabta Playa can be all of these at once, or different combinations at different moments in its long life. What ties them together is the idea that architecture, even something as low and rough as these stones, can hold memory. When you walk from one megalith to another, following a line that roughly parallels an old watercourse or points toward a familiar notch in the horizon, you're also walking a habitual route your grandparents walked. You're retracing their choices. You're being guided by their effort. The circle and its alignments do not just tell you when the rains might come, they remind you where to go when they fail. They encode, in their positions, a map of movement and survival that is bigger than any individual lifetime. And because stone lasts longer than stories told only in the air, the builders invest in it. They accept the extra labour of dragging blocks across rough ground. They test and adjust placements over several years. They tolerate imperfections in alignment because the point is not celestial perfection. The point is a durable anchor, something that will still be there when children now unborn are leading their own herds back to this basin. When the green Sahara finally collapses into the desert, we know today that network of meanings unravels. The rains shift south, the basins dry out for good. The people who once gave Nabta Playa its significance move away, or their descendants change their lifeways, following new rivers, new opportunities. The stones remain, but their stories slip beyond our reach. What the builders may have known is not lost entirely. Hints survive in the bones, in the orientations, in echoes from pastoral traditions far to the south and west. But we will probably never hear the full explanation spoken in the language that made it. What we can see with some confidence is that people who lived by cattle and weather and movement chose to make a fixed place. They tethered memory to rock. They knit water and sky into their architecture. They turned a seasonal lake into a kind of book, written in alignments and offerings, that taught each new generation how to live in a landscape that could be generous and could also turn away. To follow that knowledge further, you have to step back from the stones and look again at the broader world they were part of. A world where cattle, storms, and routes across the grassland were as central to life as any monument. If you widen your view from the circle on the ridge, the world of the people who built it comes into focus. You see long, low horizons, shallow basins that hold water for part of the year, paths not carved into stone but worn into the soil by hooves and bare feet passing season after season. You see cattle, not in the cramped fenced way modern eyes might imagine. These are animals moving slowly across open country, heads down in fresh grass after the rains, calves trotting behind their mothers, tails flicking, bulls watching from the edges of the herd, heavy with muscle and horn. To people living in this green Sahara, cattle are not just animals. They are a language. Their numbers tell you if your family is doing well or hanging on by a thread. Their condition reveals the health of the pasture weeks before your own body feels the shortage. The patterns on their hides, the shape of their horns, might carry names and stories you know, as well as the names of your children. Milk from these animals is food that doesn't require killing them. Blood, drawn carefully from a vein and mixed with milk, is protein and salt in times when meat is scarce. Hides become shelter, clothing, containers, horns become tools and ornaments, bones become needles, awls and handles. Owning cattle is like owning a living storehouse, but they are more than that. In many pastoral traditions that survive across Africa today, cattle occupy a place somewhere between property and kin. They are given names. They are the subjects of songs and praise poems. Certain animals are never slaughtered except on the most serious occasions. To describe a person as without cattle is not just an economic statement. It hints at social vulnerability, at a lack of standing and security. We cannot assume the Neolithic herders at Nabta Playa thought exactly the same way as later groups thousands of years and hundreds of miles away. Yet the careful burials of cattle at the site suggest a similar depth of feeling. You do not take an animal that represents months or years of labour, one that could give milk and calves, and place it in a stone-lined pit on a whim. When archaeologists found those pits around Nabta Playa, some with whole cattle, others with selected parts, arranged deliberately, they saw signs of ceremony. The bodies were not butchered for everyday eating and then discarded. They were laid down whole, or nearly whole, as though the animal itself had been invited to participate in something, and then escorted, respectfully, into the earth. In one burial, a young cow appears to have been placed in a chamber built just for it, as if in a little house of stone. The skull and horns in several pits were positioned with care, sometimes emphasized, sometimes oriented in consistent ways. This doesn't look like trash, it looks like ritual. Along with the animal burials, there are human graves in the broader region, some simple, some more elaborate. People buried with personal ornaments, stones arranged around or over them. The earliest hints of cemeteries that are more than just convenient places to put the dead. Taken together, these traces suggest a community that is beginning to formalize how it marks both life and loss. If your cattle link you to your own future through milk, calves, bride wealth, obligations, your dead link you to your past. You might return to the same places to remember them, to talk about who they were, what they did, what promises they made. Over time, the places themselves become thick with memory. Nabta Playa, in this sense, is not an isolated oddity. Across the green Sahara and around its fringes, stone structures begin to appear during the same broad period. To the north and west, in what is now Libya and Algeria, there are stone tumuli, mounds that cover burials. To the east, in the Nile Valley, there are early grave fields that will, millennia later, feed into the rise of Egyptian funerary practices. Farther south, in what is now Sudan, pastoral communities leave behind their own clusters of stone, grave markers, and ritual features. These places are not identical, Some emphasize human burials, some emphasize cattle. Some are clearly aligned with local topography rather than any celestial point. What they share is the sense that certain locations in the landscape have been singled out, that some spots are where you do particular things again and again in a deliberate, remembered way. Modern scholars sometimes call such areas ritual landscapes, not in the sense of grand temples with priests in special robes, but in the quieter sense of networks of meaningful places. A burial ground on this knoll, a line of standing stones along that ridge, a seasonal gathering spot near that basin. Nabta Playa fits that pattern, though it has its own flavour. Here, cattle, water, and sky converge. Your cattle need water and pasture. The water comes and goes with the rains. The rains have their own rhythm tied to the movement of the sun and stars. Your ancestors, who managed to keep herds alive through good years and bad, are remembered at spots near this basin. The stories about them are told when people meet here, when the herds drink and graze. You can start to see why fixing certain alignments in stone would feel natural. You already know that when the sun rises toward that point, the heat will grow severe. When certain stars appear near dawn, storms are likely to follow. When the first storms of the season hit, the basin below will begin to fill. By marking those cues with stone, you are not only helping yourself keep track, you are tying your knowledge to a place of shared significance. It may be that during a dry year, people stand by the stones and ask what went wrong. Did someone neglect a promise? Did a ritual for the herd go unfinished? Are the ancestors displeased, or are the winds simply changing in ways no one can control? In such a world, environment and meaning are not cleanly separated. You live with the constant awareness that the things you depend on, rain, grass, healthy animals, are not guaranteed. A mist storm can weaken a herd. 2 failed seasons can break a family. Droughts do not consult your plans, so you hedge your bets. You learn to read the sky, as we saw in the previous section. You move when you must. You share resources and obligations with neighbouring groups. And you also cultivate relationships with what you might call the unseen, the powers, ancestors, or principles that, in your understanding, sit behind the visible patterns. Rituals with cattle at Nabta Playa are probably part of that hedging. Slaughtering a prized animal in a formal way, at a formal place, at a particular time in the seasonal cycle, is an act of trust and desperation at once. You give up some security now in the hope of more security later. You demonstrate loyalty to your group and to the forces you believe sustain you. The stone circle, the cattle burials, the carefully arranged megaliths become coordinates in a map that is part practical, part spiritual. When researchers compare Nabta Playa to later sites like Stonehenge or to the elaborate cattle cults of historic African societies, there are tempting parallels. A circular arrangement of stones, possible astronomical alignments, animals treated as something more than meat. But direct equations are risky. Stonehenge stands in a different ecology, emerges in a different social structure, and is linked to different mythologies. Historical cattle rituals among the Dinka, Nuer, or Maasai are embedded in traditions that have been shaped by thousands of years of change. What feels safer to say is that humans in many places and times have reached for similar tools when facing the same kinds of questions. How do we know when to move? How do we remember agreements long after the people who made them are gone? How do we honour the things that keep us alive? Water, animals, ancestors, the sky itself. At Nabta Playa, the answers seem to have involved stone, bone, and horizon lines. The people who built and used this place did not separate astronomy from religion or ecology from ritual the way modern categories do. Watching the stars was part of managing the herd. Managing the herd was part of honouring obligations. Honouring obligations pleased the ancestors. Pleased ancestors, in turn, might be credited when the rains returned on time. Meaning here is layered. A row of stones pointing roughly toward a solstice sunrise is at once a practical marker, a reminder of past seasons, an emblem of shared knowledge, and a silent participant in ceremonies no one wrote down. Stand in that world for a moment. The lake below you swells with the latest rains. Cattle drink along the shore. their reflections rippling in the shallows. Children run between tethered calves laughing. Smoke from cooking fires drifts upward in thin, pale columns. As evening comes on, people drift toward the ridge, toward the stones, and the old pits that hold the bones of animals long gone. Someone begins a chant about the first herds, about the bargain between humans, cattle, and sky. Somewhere in that chant is a reminder, when this star rises before dawn, we will think about moving south. When the sun reaches that point between two stones, we will prepare for the hard heat. When the basin drops to bare mud, we will remember who helped us last time and who we owe now. A world of cattle, water, and sky is not just scenery for a monument. It is the living web that gives the monument its purpose. And as the climate shifts, as the rains become less predictable, and the green horizon begins its slow retreat, that web will be stretched to its limit. The stone circle on the ridge will still point to where the sun rises. The old pits will still hold their silent cattle. But the certainty that once wrapped around those alignments will begin to fray. To see how that unravelling might have felt, you have to follow these herders into a time when the seasonal lake failed more often than it filled, and when the people who gathered around Nabta Playa had to decide whether their future still lay in this landscape at all. The first bad year might not even feel like the beginning of an ending. The storms are late. The sky builds its usual thick, promising clouds, but they move past without breaking. When the rain finally comes, it's shorter, more scattered. The basin at Nabta Playa fills, but not as deeply. The grass grows, but in thinner patches. The cattle drink and graze, but their ribs show a little more by the end of the dry season. People mutter about it. They mention an ancestor who saw something similar once, long ago. They say it will balance out next time. The stones on the ridge still catch the sun at the right points. The stars still rise where they're supposed to. The pattern looks intact. But the next year is not better. This time the basin never quite reaches the mark old people remember, the place on the shore where children once played at the high water line. The mud crust at the edges shows more quickly. You can stand at the spot where your grandparents said they used to fish and find only shallow puddles, warm and clouded. The cattle walk farther for grass. You can hear their hooves knocking against harder ground. Calves born this season are smaller. A few don't make it through their first dry spell. People notice, but they adjust. They cull weaker animals. They share milk more carefully. They visit neighbours more often, asking who has heard of better pasture to the south, to the west, to the barely remembered edges of the world. A bad pair of years, elders say, is not unheard of. Stories exist precisely to hold such memories. The tale of the time when the lake was a chain of little ponds. The time when people slaughtered an old bull at the stone circle with tears in their eyes, because they needed the meat, but also needed to show they trusted the bond between cattle, water, and sky. So they repeat those stories now, with a slight edge in their voices that children are not supposed to hear. Then another year comes, and this one isn't just bad. It feels wrong. The first rains blow in from the south, as always, but they are thin, ragged, quickly drunk by the parched soil. The clouds that should follow never arrive. The basin pools only in its deepest hollow. The shallower arms that used to host small fish and reeds stay dry, cracked into hexagons. Dust rides the wind more often. On some days, the horizon seems closer, not because the world has shrunk, but because the air holds so much suspended earth that distant hills fade into brown. Lakes and seasonal wetlands across the broader Sahara begin to falter in their own times. Not all at once, like a curtain dropping, but in a long, staggered sequence. A depression hundreds of kilometres away might still be green when Nabta Playa is already struggling. Another basin might hold steady water for a generation longer before its own drying quickens. This unevenness shapes human choices. For some groups, the first response is to stretch their usual routes. Where you once moved between a small set of familiar basins and pastures, you now push farther. You spend more days walking between water sources, more nights wondering if the next hollow will be full or empty. You return to Nabta Playa out of habit and obligation. It is where your ancestors are buried, where your cattle bones rest in stone-lined pits, where you have promised to meet kin and exchange marriages, goods and news. But as the years pass, the window when the basin holds reliable water shrinks. Maybe you used to arrive in early summer and stay through the height of the season. Now you delay your arrival, because the early rains are no longer enough. When you do come, you stay for fewer weeks. The shoreline where children chased each other is now a dry slope of dust and stones, conversations at the gathering shift tone. In earlier times, people at Nabta Playa might have argued about whose cattle looked healthiest or which line of stones was truest to the solstice. Now, they argue about rumours of better conditions elsewhere. Someone has heard of a valley where the river never truly dries, even when the rains falter. A strip of green that snakes between low cliffs, fed by unseen sources. It lies to the east, they say, beyond a line of low hills, beyond the place where your grandparents say they once traded for stone and shell. Those rumours are the first whispers of the Nile. We know from the geological record that as the Sahara dried, the Nile Valley remained a kind of refuge, a corridor, where groundwater, seasonal floods and river-fed soils stayed more stable than the lands to either side. We also know that different parts of the desert shifted at different paces. Some areas clung to their wetlands centuries longer. Others began to resemble the modern Sahara much earlier. For the communities around places like Nabta Playa, this likely meant not a neat, single migration, but a long, braided flow of movement. Some families probably left early. A hard drought might push a band to follow a trader's route east and simply not come back. Others stayed, hoping for the return of the old pattern. They doubled down on rituals at the stones. They sacrificed precious animals they could scarcely afford to lose, pleading with whatever powers they believed governed the rains. Children grew up with a different sense of normal. For their grandparents, the story of Nabta Playa was one of abundance, wide shallows, vigorous grass, gatherings that felt secure. For them, it is a story of thresholds. Will there be water when we arrive this year? Will our cousins still come from the south, or have they found somewhere better? Will the stars we mark in the sky still mean what they used to? As the drying continues, the answers increasingly tilt toward no. At some point, no one moment we can point to in the archaeological record, but an accumulation of choices. Nabta Playa ceases to function as a dependable hub. People come less often. When they do, the gatherings are smaller. The great cattle burials stop. The stone circle continues to stand on its ridge, but fewer feet pass between the megaliths. The stories that reference this place start to carry a note of elegy. For you, if you belong to one of the last generations to use this basin, leaving is not a simple act. You're not just walking away from a water source. You're walking away from your calendar in stone, from the graves of ancestors, from the pits where honoured cattle lie. You're walking away from the specific patch of sky that your elders taught you to read. But you do not walk empty-handed. You carry with you techniques for managing cattle in marginal lands, songs that encode the sequence of stars and seasons, rituals that tie animal sacrifice to promises of social support, taboos about where and how the dead should be laid to rest, ways of marking special places with stone and earth. When groups begin to gather more often along the Nile, on its west bank, on the low desert edges, near small tributaries and back channels, they bring these things into contact with other traditions. People arriving from different corners of the shrinking green Sahara meet communities who have long lived closer to the river, who may have relied more on fishing, wild plants, and early cultivation. Ideas do not stay neatly sorted by origin. They mingle. A habit developed at a place like Nabta Playa. The burial of cattle with care, the setting up of stones to fix a horizon line, does not vanish when the basin dries. It has a good chance of reappearing in modified form, folded into new practices. This is one way to think about the deep prehistory of regions that will later host the first Egyptian states, not as a clean slate wiped by climate, then written upon anew by farmers on the Nile, but as a palimpsest. The drying of the Sahara does not simply erase culture. It redirects it, concentrates it, and recombines it. When we look at the archaeological traces, we see hints of this convergence. Grave fields in Upper Egypt and Nubia, where cattle remain play roles in ritual. Stone markers on low desert plateaus that echo faintly the idea of meaningful alignments. Decorative motifs that might carry echoes of earlier pastoral symbolism. These are not straightforward lines of descent we can prove beyond doubt, but they suggest continuity through change rather than total rupture. For the people living through it, of course, there is no macro view. There is only the memory of grass, where now there is dust. The knowledge that your children will grow up knowing a different set of watering places, a different cluster of stars at the centre of their stories. As you follow your herd toward the Nile or some other refuge, you may tell them about Nabta Playa, the way others once told you about a long-ago flood or drought, as something half historical, half mythic. You point to a certain star and say, when that one rose just before dawn, we knew it was time to think of moving. We had stones to remind us. They are still there, somewhere in the desert, watching a sky that no longer speaks to anyone the way it once spoke to us. In that sense, what was lost when seasonal gathering places like Nabta Playa were abandoned was not only a location, but a particular way of tying land, sky, and society together. What survived was the habit of tying them at all, the conviction that relationships between people, animals, ancestors, and celestial rhythms matter and can be inscribed, whether in stone circles around a shrinking lake, or in the emerging monuments along a river that never quite forgets its desert origins. When you finally reach the river valley, it doesn't feel like the beginning of a famous civilization. It feels like compromise. The Nile is not a single shining ribbon of water. It is a complicated thing, shifting channels, patches of floodplain, strips of damp earth fading into gravel and rock. In some seasons, parts of it stink of slow water and rotting plants. In others, it shrinks back, leaving mud that cracks in the sun. But compared to the places you've been leaving behind, it is astonishingly reliable. There is always some green. There are reeds that never quite vanish. There are fish in the deeper pools. And there are people, more people than you are used to seeing in one place, because the river pulls bands and families the way a distant fire draws travellers at night. If you come from a place like Nabta Playa, you bring your cattle and your habits with you. You pick the higher ground just beyond the main floodplain, where the river's rise and fall won't drown your camp. The soil here is different, softer underfoot, layered with silt and sand. The horizon is narrower. The world no longer opens in a wide bowl of sky, but is framed by low desert on one side and green on the other. Yet, some things feel familiar. There are still seasonal rhythms. Instead of waiting for scattered monsoon storms to refill a basin, you begin to watch for the slow swelling of the river, the spreading of water across its banks. The sky still matters. Certain stars still serve as markers, even if the timing is slightly different. You still listen for the first frogs of the flood season, smell the damp soil, note how your cattle respond. Archaeologists looking back at this long gradual convergence see suggestive echoes rather than clear scripts. In the pre-dynastic period of Upper Egypt, the millennia before pharaohs and pyramids, there are graveyards where cattle are not just food or property, but part of the language of ritual. In some cemeteries, the remains of cattle appear in tombs as offerings, sometimes treated with attention that feels almost like respect for individuals, not just meat. Farther south, in what we now call Nubia, there are burials from even earlier times where cattle are the main event. Animals laid out in pits, sometimes with decorative elements, their interment clearly more than simple disposal of a carcass. The pattern rings a quiet bell if you've just been thinking about Nabta Playa's cattle burials and the careful way those animals were placed in stone-lined pits. Nobody can say, with absolute certainty, that the people burying cattle by the early Nile are direct descendants of those who once did so out on the desert basins. The time spans are large, the Sahara is vast. Cultures move, mingle, split, and recombine. Some archaeologists argue for strong lines of continuity. Others warn that similarities can arise independently, especially where similar ways of life face similar challenges. But the resemblance is hard to ignore. In both worlds, the shrinking green Sahara, and the emerging river societies, cattle are more than economic assets. They are social glue, ritual focus, symbols of well-being that stand in for the health of the group and its relationship with the unseen. You can imagine a conversation on a Nile bank between a long-settled fisher farmer and a newcomer from the west who still carries the memory of desert stone circles. The river person might speak of the flood, of the way its height each year signals whether the coming season will be generous or tight. They might point to a marks on rock, scratches, shallow cups, perhaps an early attempt to track water levels or time. The desert person might nod and talk about another kind of marking, stones set in deliberate patterns around a former lake, aligned with rising stars. Cattle bones placed in pits on the shore as part of agreements with powers tied to rain and sky. Neither is copying the other, but as they share stories, their children might begin to blend these ways of thinking. When we read later Egyptian myths, thousands of years after Nabta Playa fell silent, we find gods who merge cattle with divinity. Hathor, often shown as a cow or a woman with cow's horns and ears, is linked to fertility, motherhood, and the sky itself. The Apis bull, kept in Memphis as a living manifestation of power, is selected with extreme care, treated with ritual, mourned and buried with pomp when it dies. Deep in royal tombs and temple walls, there are scenes where cattle process in orderly lines, where offerings of cattle are carved into stone that will outlast generations. In some funerary texts, the afterlife is imagined as a kind of perfect landscape with fields, water, and herds. None of this proves a straight line back to Nabta Playa. Myths and symbols can shift roles and meanings over long spans of time. Cattle are important across huge parts of Africa for reasons that have nothing to do with a single stone circle. But if you step back and soften your focus, a motif persists: animals, water, and sky bound together in a sacred landscape. The early Nile communities also begin to do something that would have made sense to a stone setter from the desert. They mark the land itself as sacred. On low desert edges above the floodplain, people pile stones into cairns, build small enclosures, perhaps lay out lines that align with local horizons. Later, in the Naqada period, we see more formal cemeteries with graves oriented in consistent ways, sometimes paired with simple markers that fix a relationship between body, earth, and sky. As time passes, these tendencies grow into a more monumental habit. Tombs become mastabas, rectangular brick platforms. Villages see the emergence of shrines. The earliest known temples appear in Upper Egypt and Nubia as modest, sometimes barely more than a carefully chosen space with offerings. Eventually, after centuries of experiment and consolidation, these impulses culminate in the great temples and pyramids of the pharaonic state, vast stone structures aligned with cardinal directions, solstices, and certain stars. It is in these big, later monuments that scholars most often mention Nabta Playa, when they note that some pyramids and temples are aligned with astonishing astronomical precision. They wonder aloud how far back such habits of skywatching might go. When they see shrines that link the king's power with the rising sun or with particular star groups, they think of scores of earlier people who learned to read the heavens long before anyone carved hieroglyphs. Nabta Playa becomes part of that conversation, not because it is a direct ancestor of a specific temple, but because it is one of the clearest, oldest cases we know where African pastoralists inscribed cosmic rhythms in stone. It's a reminder that by the time Egyptian scribes were writing on papyrus about gods and seasons, they were inheriting a deep, mostly unwritten history of people who had been treating the sky as a partner in planning and meaning for many thousands of years. Migration, in this view, is not just bodies moving from dry basins to damp riverbanks. It is also ideas being carried in songs and customs. A herding group pushed east by failing rains doesn't arrive as a blank slate. They bring a preference for certain kinds of ritual gatherings, an expectation that important places should be marked, a sense that agreements with the invisible world are best expressed through animals that matter most. They meet fishing folk and early cultivators whose own traditions have grown in a narrower, river-focused environment. Maybe these river people think in terms of flood marks instead of stone circles, of fish runs instead of cattle burials. But under pressure to share land and resources, all of them are motivated to build shared rituals, shared narratives that can knit different groups into larger, more stable communities. Over generations, practices blend. A feast that once centered on cattle sacrifice under an open desert sky might shift to a more enclosed setting near the river, but keep the animal at its heart. A way of timing seasonal moves by stars might evolve into a ritual calendar tied to both stellar risings and the measured behavior of the Nile. A habit of marking important places with rough stones might be refined into carefully laid brick, then into cut limestone. From our distance, we see only thin slices of this process. A grave here, a pot there, a cluster of post holes that once held a shrine. It's tempting to draw neat arrows. Desert pastoralist leads to Proto-Nile town, which leads to Nabta chiefdom, which leads to the First Dynasty. Reality was almost certainly messier. Some desert traditions probably died out with the last people who practiced them. Others might have been reinvented from scratch by different groups confronting similar landscapes. And some apparent parallels, a cattle burial, a sky alignment, might be coincidences in a world where many humans everywhere responded to sun, stars and animals in broadly comparable ways. Yet the echoes remain compelling. When you look at Nabta Playa's stone circle, and then at a much later temple whose axis catches the sunrise on a particular day, it's hard not to imagine a long continuity of attention, eyes raised to the same sky, minds turning the same question over and over. How do we anchor our lives to rhythms bigger than ourselves? When you see a carefully buried cow in a pre-dynastic cemetery and remember the cattle laid out by a drying lake, you can't help but think about how precious animals become symbols, passports between this world and whatever lies beyond. We should hold all of this lightly, conscious of how much we do not know, but in the quiet of the desert night, with stars burning above abandoned stones, and in the hush of a tomb corridor under a pyramid, where carved cattle walk eternally toward an unseen offering table, there is a shared insistence that the landscape and the sky over it is not just backdrop, it is a participant in human life. It remembers. Nabta Playa helps us glimpse that this insistence did not begin with kings on the Nile. It was already alive when small groups of herders watched the monsoon sky over a temporary lake, counted their cattle, and set stones so that their grandchildren would remember where and when the world once felt in balance. If Nabta Playa were only a random scatter of stones and bones, the mystery would have faded long ago. But it isn't. Even in its eroded, half-buried state, there are pieces that strongly suggest deliberate planning, repeated use, and ideas that go beyond simple day-to-day survival. There is the stone circle itself, for one thing. Not a ring of boulders tossed down by chance, but a cluster of upright slabs arranged in a pattern that is compact, measured, and distinct from the surrounding landscape. Some of those stones line up within a few degrees with the rising sun at solstice. Others seem to pick out the rising points of stars that would have been prominent in the summer sky around the time when rains and lake filling mattered most. There are the larger megaliths scattered along alignments that stretch across the basin. Some stand in lines that point toward places where the ancient lake would once have lain. Others appear to track north-south or align with specific points on the horizon. Their placement is not random. When archaeologists map them, patterns emerge. Axes, clusters, geometries that imply someone had a mental map of this basin and chose where to stand stones within it. There are the cattle burials, animals carefully laid out in stone-lined pits, in some cases with skulls arranged with attention, bodies intact rather than butchered. These are not dumps of bones after a meal. They are deposits created with effort, digging a deep pit in hard desert ground, building a stone casing, placing a whole cow inside. That's a decision, not an accident. Underneath one of the stone alignments, excavators found a buried structure sometimes called a tumuli complex or megalithic installation. It combines stone, pits, and what look like prepared surfaces. It was used, rebuilt, and reused over time. That kind of investment in a particular spot suggests it was important in a way that outlasted any single season. Taken together, these elements look less like random activity and more like what we usually mean by monument, a place intentionally shaped to hold memory, ritual, or meaning. Yet the more archaeologists uncover, the more stubborn the uncertainty becomes. The problem is not that there is no evidence. The problem is the kind of evidence we have. At Nabta Playa, there are no stone walls covered in carved stories, no painted panels that show people leading cattle to a circle under a particular star. There are no clay tablets describing the festival of first rain, held every year when a certain constellation returned to the sky. There are only stones, bones, shards of pottery, a few hearths and post holes, scattered charcoal, and the ghostly outlines of ancient shores. This is the normal state of deep prehistory. For tens of thousands of years, humans lived, loved, argued, and planned with minds as complex as ours, but without leaving written explanations of what they were doing or why. When archaeologists step into that silence, they have to work like detectives who find the crime scene but no witnesses. You examine what is left: placement, wear patterns, ash layers, animal remains. You compare with other sites. You test soil, date charcoal, model old skies on computers. And then you try to tell the most plausible story that fits the pattern. But plausibility is not the same as certainty. For instance, when we see the stone circles' apparent alignments on solstice sunrise, it is sensible to think somebody cared about that moment. Perhaps they watched for it year after year, using it to anchor their seasonal calendar. Perhaps they connected it to the coming of rains, to cattle movements, to ceremonies. Yet we have to admit there are limits. A small circle with a handful of stones can, by chance alone, produce lines that point roughly towards significant celestial events. Distinguishing intent from coincidence requires careful statistics, knowledge of ancient horizons, and some decisions about what counts as close enough. Similarly, when we see cattle buried whole, we infer that they had ritual importance. Maybe people believed these animals would accompany them into an afterlife. Maybe they were offerings to a sky spirit or a rain power. Maybe a beloved leader was commemorated through the burial of a treasured animal. All of these are plausible. None can be proven in detail. Every interpretation leans on analogies. We look to later cattle-keeping cultures in Africa that sacrifice animals to mark key events. We look to societies that align monuments with the stars. We use their well-documented stories to help us imagine possibilities for people who left no texts. But analogies are double-edged. Use too few and you see nothing. Use them too freely and you risk projecting somebody else's beliefs onto people who might have thought very differently. On top of that, the evidence itself is incomplete and changing. Nabta Playa is not preserved in glass. It sits in a harsh environment where wind, sand, and occasional rare floods keep working on the remains. Some stones may have fallen or been moved by natural processes. Others might have been dragged away in antiquity or in recent times for construction or out of simple curiosity. Desert erosion is deceptive. In some places, it strips surfaces clean, leaving artifacts exposed on a deflated plain. In others, it buries entire features under meters of shifting sand. What we see today is a snapshot taken at one moment in a very long process of exposure and burial. Early excavations at Nabta Playa also reflected the questions and methods of their time. The first teams were often focused on the most obvious features: the circle, the largest megaliths, the most striking burials. As decades have passed, techniques have improved. New surveys pick up faint traces of structures and activity areas that were invisible before. Radiocarbon dating has become more precise. Satellite imagery and ground-penetrating tools reveal old lake shores and gentle ridges that help archaeologists reconstruct how people moved and camped. As methods change, so do interpretations. What might once have been confidently labelled a temple may later be reclassified as a ritual aggregation site, or simply a specialised activity area when more cautious voices point out that the original label implied too much. Timelines get adjusted as new dates come in. Hypotheses about the exact stars involved in an alignment shift when people recalculate ancient precession or refine horizon models. This is not inconsistency so much as humility gradually enforced by data. It's one reason Nabta Playa still feels elusive. Every time you think you can pin it down, this was an observatory, this was a cattle cult centre, this was a seasonal pilgrimage site, you run into another layer of uncertainty. The site shows clear signs of planning and shared meaning. But the exact content of that meaning keeps sliding out of reach. Part of that elusiveness comes from time, part from erosion, and part from our own position. We live in a world saturated with text, diagrams, schedules, and precise explanations. We're used to thinking that if something matters deeply, someone will write it down. At Nabta Playa, nothing was written in a way we can still read. The knowledge was stored in memory, in practice, in stories told around fires that have long since cooled. The stones we see are the barest outline of those stories, like punctuation marks left after all the words have vanished. Yet even those fragments tell us something important. They remind us that climates themselves can become a kind of eraser. When the monsoon belt retreated north and the lakes vanished, whole ways of life were squeezed out of existence or forced to migrate. Ritual sites that once sat at the heart of seasonal gatherings were abandoned, buried, forgotten. Later people living along the Nile or farther afield kept some elements, cattle as symbols, sky watching, the marking of sacred places. But the particular configuration that made Nabta Playa what it was faded away. If we hadn't happened to find it, if the sands had covered it a little deeper, or erosion had scattered its stones a little more, our picture of African prehistory would be poorer without us even knowing there was a gap. That, perhaps, is the most unsettling lesson. For every Nabta Playa that emerges from the desert, how many other green worlds have been wiped clean by shifting wind belts, rising seas, advancing ice? How many chapters of human ingenuity took place in landscapes that no longer exist in anything like their former form? We tend to imagine the past as a stable backdrop, with civilizations appearing like bright points on a fixed stage. But the stage itself keeps changing. Forests become deserts, coasts drown, grasslands turn to scrub. Each transformation can hide or preserve, erase or reveal. The prehistoric herders who set stones by a lake in the Sahara probably did not think of themselves as mysterious. They were simply doing what made sense in their world, watching the sky, tending cattle, gathering at particular places, marking them so the next generation would remember. The mystery is ours, not theirs. We stand far away in time, trying to read intention in the placement of a stone, to hear ritual in the silence of a burial pit. Sometimes we succeed just enough to glimpse what we have lost. And as we do, the modern desert around Nabta Playa takes on a strange double quality. On the surface, it is the Sahara we recognize today, a wide, pale emptiness under a hard sky, dunes and gravel stretching towards shimmering horizons. Nothing about it suggests lakeside feasts, star-marked ceremonies, or careful conversations about when the rains will come. But layered beneath that silence is the memory of a different Sahara, one green enough to support herds and gatherings, inventive enough to build monuments without writing, attentive enough to tie cattle, water, and sky together in patterns we are still struggling to decode. When we talk about why Nabta Playa remains a mystery, we are really talking about the meeting point of these two deserts, the one that lives in the stones and bones, and the one that has buried them. In the final quiet, if you let your imagination soften the edges, you can almost feel both at once. The dry wind that now blows sand over half-toppled megaliths, and the older breeze that once carried the smell of wet earth and cattle, the sound of voices counting seasons by stars that still rise, unchanged, over a landscape that has forgotten the lakes that once reflected them. The Sahara you see on a map tonight looks final, a huge pale blotch across North Africa, a place we shorthand as empty, lifeless, inhospitable. A space between the real centres of history along the Nile, the Mediterranean, the savannas farther south. But if you followed this story all the way here, that image is harder to hold on to. Now, when you imagine the Sahara, there's another layer beneath it, A quieter picture, but a fuller one. Shallow lakes held in broad basins, grasses shimmering in afternoon light, paths worn smooth by hooves and bare feet. People watching the sky with the same careful intensity your ancestors used to read plants and tracks. Cattle breathing in the cool of evening while someone, somewhere, decides to lift a stone and set it upright in just the right place. The desert that covers all this is real. So, is the green world underneath it? Even if it exists now only as fossils, shorelines, scattered tools, and circles of stone. The wonder is not just that climate could turn one into the other. It's that in a landscape we think of as nowhere, people once invested in meaning as seriously as any emperor building a pyramid or a temple. They carried ideas in their heads instead of on paper. They marked time with shadows and stars instead of clocks. They tied their lives to water, animals, and sky in ways we can sense, but not fully translate. When we say Nabta Playa is mysterious, it's tempting to blame the silence of the past. But the past is not entirely silent. It speaks in fragments. A line of stones here, a buried cow there, a potsherd in old lake mud, a charcoal fleck that fixes a date. The fragments don't add up to a single, neat story. They suggest possibilities, patterns and echoes, then stop halfway through a sentence. Maybe that incompleteness is part of their gift. They leave room for imagination without letting it run wild. They force us to live with uncertainty, to accept that some chapters of human creativity will remain partly closed, even as we press our ears to the keyhole. As you drift towards sleep, you might let both deserts overlap for a moment. See the dunes, but also the water filling the basin. Hear the wind, but also the lowing of cattle and soft voices counting seasons by the rising of a star. Picture the stone circle, half buried now, standing clearly on firm ground under a sky so dark and sharp it feels close enough to touch. The modern Sahara will still be there in the morning, wide and bright and seemingly empty. But somewhere beneath it, in memory and in stone, the green Sahara still waits. If you've enjoyed wandering through that older landscape tonight, you can gently tap like and subscribe for more quiet journeys into the past. If you feel like sharing, let us know in the comments where you're listening from right now. Another point of light, another voice, under the same long sky.